My name is Michael Weisbach, and I've never done one of these before, but this is, I guess, a tutorial, and I'm supposed to give a lecture on, I was told to give a lecture on something related to finance without much guidance. And let me just get a little bit of water here. And I've decided to do, and I guess some other speakers are sort of giving surveys of various literatures, and I've decided not to do that, and I've started to talk about kind of a series of papers that I've been working on with Pam, who's sitting right there in the, with a smile on her face, and Tracy Wong, who can't be with us today because she's got this like teaching thing that professors have to do from time to time, and so the whole, it's sort of a series of papers that we sort of look at with the grand title, Do CEOs Matter? And so what I'm going to do is first I'll give you an overview of the papers, and then I will talk about two of the papers, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we think our next paper is going to be. And I have no idea how long it will take, but please feel free to ask questions if you want. And anyway, so the motivation, I mean, I think about this as obviously we're finance professors and this is the FMA, but I think about this as a sort of a bigger question in terms of business schools and management. And much of what we do in business schools concerns the role of the CEO and the management team. And so that if we think about what you would learn in your economics class about how to think about the CEO and the management team, well, the first thing you learn in an economics class is what we would call the first best world. So in other words, how in that first best world, the CEO would always pick value maximizing investments, right? And if that's the case, then there's not a whole lot of role for the CEO unless his skill is something that changes the set of first best investments in some way or another. And in a world with agency problems, there's many different agency problems that are in the literature, and you could just we listed some of them there. The CEOs, they've been accused of shirking, overinvesting, underinvesting, enjoying the quiet life, building empires, and they're all very interesting, plausible stories. But it's hard to know when you're thinking about the role, how the firm works conceptually, or when you're teaching students, what the right model of CEOs is. And so how does one go about thinking about this conceptually, and how does one distinguish between these big worldviews empirically is not at all obvious how to do it. And so that to identify the role of the management and the management team and the CEO in particular, how would you do that empirically, given the host of empirical difficulties that one would face? In other words, there's heterogeneity across firms and across managers. There's different kinds of CEOs are matched with different kinds of firms. And how does one think about it conceptually, and how does one get a handle on it? And there is a nice existing literature. The most famous paper is Bertrand and Shore, where they relate the CEO attributes or fixed effects to various kinds of firm policies. And we do in our papers, we think of as very complementary to this literature. And what we do is we actually kind of look at intertemporal changes in firm policies and firm policies, values, and interactions with the financial markets over the tenure. And the sort of underlying assumption is that things change in systematic ways over CEO tenure. So that one thing that changes is the uncertainty about the CEO's ability, his strategy, his match with the firm. That will tend to decrease over time. And the other thing, and simultaneously, the CEO's incentives and his power are potentially going to increase over time. And so therefore, we're able to sort of draw some hypotheses about how one would expect managers to matter and evaluate them using the data. So that's kind of the general big picture approach. And what we've done is we actually have two papers that are finished, and we started a third. And so the first paper we call Learning About CEO Ability and Stock Return Volatility. And the idea here is that uncertainty about ability is an important source of the firm's overall uncertainty and equity volatility. And so what we do is we actually have a model of how the CEO would affect the firm, and how would it affect volatility, and then we go out and estimate that and actually back out an estimate of how much the CEO's value, how important CEOs are to a typical firm from the volatility changes over his tenure. In the second paper, which I'll talk about in the second half of the talk, we call it CEO investment cycles. And what we do is we look at how investment and firm growth vary over a CEO's tenure. And it turns out that there are very systematic patterns of investment and disinvestment over a CEO's tenure. And what we do is we kind of document exactly how they look empirically, and then we sort of test a bunch of explanations for why they could occur. And the bottom line in that paper is that we think they occur because of various agency considerations having to do with divesting the previous CEOs bad investments and then making their own investments, which over time get increasingly worse. And we have a whole series of tests that will sort of try and get at that explanation and distinguish it from other explanations. The paper we're working on now, which hopefully will be ready maybe by the spring, Yuhui, yeah, and so we will work on that. We call it uncertainty about management and corporate financing, and the whole question is how much, the cost of finance is related to uncertainty about the firm, but how much is that uncertainty about the firm's fundamentals, and how much does that uncertainty have to do with uncertainty about what managers will do with the assets of the firm? And so what we do in that paper, we have some preliminary results that suggest that when uncertainty about management is higher, then the cost of finance is actually higher for firms, because and the logic is that when the uncertainty about what managers are going to do with the money is higher, then not surprisingly the banks are going to charge a higher interest rate to lend money to the firm. Anyway, that doesn't exist yet, so hopefully it will exist in a few months. But I'm going to do that in the next sort of 45 minutes. I'm going to hope to sort of go through the first two papers and then maybe have some discussion later on. Okay. So the first paper is called Learning About Ability and Stock Return Volatility. And the paper is sort of based around what we think of as kind of an interesting idea. And the idea is that, just intuitively, suppose that a firm has a CEO, and the CEO has an uncertain ability. So in other words, we don't know how good the CEO is. And when we say that, we mean not just how smart and how talented he is, but how well does he match with the assets of the firm. How much is he may be brought in to bring in to use a certain kind of strategy, and that strategy may or may not work with the firm depending upon the match between that CEO and the firm. And suppose that that's true, that's your underlying assumption, and that the firm receives a cash flow news, and just suppose that it's better than expected, and if it's worse than expected, everything works in reverse. Then what will happen? Well, the market will update two things. Okay? The market will take the cash flow news and say this is good news about the firm, and it will update the value of the firm just like we teach in every one of our finance classes. So when there's good cash flow news, the value of the stock will go up, right? But there's a second effect as well. And the second effect is that your assessment of the manager's ability will go up as well. Okay? And so what happens is that when there's good news which is good news because it's good news, but then there's good news which is good news because of the fact that it causes you to think that there's going to be more good news in the future because of the fact that you now have a perceived better manager. And so there's an extra kick that increases the firm's stock price. And what happens is that when the CEO has a really uncertain ability, that extra kick is larger, and then over time it sort of declines because we kind of know how good the CEO is. And so that pictorially, the way to think about it is suppose there's two firms with the same stream of cash flow news, but one of which has a new CEO and one of which has an old CEO. Okay? Well, then what will happen is the news will affect firm's profitability, but it will also affect the second channel that I just described, which will lead to an updated assessment of his ability and lead to an increase in expected future ability. And so the point is that having these two firms, one with a new CEO, one with an old CEO, the one with the new CEO, the stock price will go up more than the one with the old CEO if there's good news, good cash flow news, because of the fact that we'll update our assessment of his ability. And so that this would imply, and of course the same thing is true with bad cash flow news. And so that if there's bad news about the firm's cash flows, then if there's an established CEO, then there will just be bad news about the firm's cash flows. But if there's a new CEO, there's a double whammy, because there's bad news about the firm's cash flows, plus people will think that the CEO isn't very good, and so they'll expect more bad news in the future. And so that the good news gets augmented up, the bad news gets augmented down, and so that there's higher volatility when there's more uncertainty about the new CEO. And that's kind of the implication of this. And so that it predicts a positive relation about the uncertainty about CEO ability and stock return volatility. And as uncertainty about ability decreases over time, stock return volatility decreases over time. And so so that what we do is then we are able to use the changes in stock return volatility to estimate this model, and to back out an estimate of how important ability is to the firm, and also back out estimates of the whole learning process, the speed of learning and the shape of the learning curve. And so so that's kind of the game plan for the first paper. And so what we do is we present a stylized model that is really based on some work by Pastor and Veronese, and it's also related to some of the corporate finance literature on learning and management incentives that I've done some work on. But the most famous paper is the Holmstrom 1999 paper, which really developed the whole idea to begin with. And the nice thing about the model, what we think, is that it generates lots of predictions, both time series and cross-sectional predictions, about the relation between stock return volatility and uncertainty about ability. And so the identification in our empirics comes from both the time series and the cross-section. And so the empirical implications are, and to lay them out, well, the time series implications about volatility is, so holding other factors constant, the return volatility should decline over the tenure. And another prediction is that decline should be convex. So it should be faster in early periods than in later periods. And the other thing is that the magnitude of the stock price reaction to corporate news should have a convex decline over tenure. And what we do is empirically we identify this learning process using within firms variation in volatility of tenure, especially in the first 3 years. The other set of implications are cross-sectional, and basically what we find is that the learning curve should be steepest when uncertainty about ability is the highest, and it also should be steepest when the news is most informative about ability. So in other words, if you estimate the slope of the learning curve, which is the rate of decline of volatility over time, these empirical implications should hold. Okay. So that in other words, what we try and do is we try and distinguish the learning story from just kind of other stories that would lead to a time series change in volatility by looking at specific characteristics of the management team and seeing how they affect the decline in stock price return. And again, we identify this empirically using heterogeneity across firms and CEOs. So, and we consider a bunch of alternative explanations. There could be non-random timing of turnovers. There could be post-turnover real changes. There could be post-turnover revelation about fundamentals, and a bunch of other explanations. And so the bottom line is that we were pleasantly surprised that most of all the empirical implications actually turned out to be consistent with the learning model, and moreover we estimate that uncertainty about ability actually accounts for a substantial fraction, between 26 to 29% of the overall stock return volatility at the time of the turnover, and of course it declines over time. But still, we think that one of the bottom lines is that management is important to firms, and that has an important influence on how volatile their stock is. and that a lot of the uncertainty that creates stock return volatility comes from uncertainty about what managers will actually do with the assets of the firm, which to me is not at all surprising. And so what we think about this is complementing some other papers that we use. Our estimates are all based on the second moment of returns, and and then we have a large sample, and they complement those from other papers that have looked at the first moment in rare events, so looking at CEO death and hospitalization and things like that. And so we don't think we're the only paper that looks at the value of CEOs, but certainly we think that this is a new approach to doing it. So I'm going to go through the model and pretty quickly. It's a stylized model, and it's continuous time. It's actually fairly easy to understand, I think. So I'll try and explain it to you. So basically, the stock price is given by this. It just assumes that it's the expected value of dividends, and the dividend process varies with this formula. So alpha dt plus sigma dw. So alpha is the ability of the CEO. And so basically what the ability of the CEO does, even though we can't observe it directly, is it affects the dividend process. And by affecting the dividend process, we can draw inferences about what our updated posterior is about his ability. And also the sigma is there's a fundamental volatility. So the firm's assets will vary just because of sigma, but what we're going to show is that there's an extra source of volatility coming from uncertainty about alpha. And that's what we focus the paper on. And so the speed of learning is given by these equations. And so basically alpha is distributed normally with a mean of theta, and theta of t, which theta of t is the sort of conditional mean at any point in time. And delta is the variance of alpha, delta squared. And so basically, over time, what happens is you learn alpha better and better, and so delta declines over time. Because, and it's sort of, if you were to repeat this over to infinity, then delta would become sort of infinitely small, and then eventually the only thing that would matter would be the fundamental volatility. Okay. Now, the d theta is the change in the expected mean of alpha. So in other words, what theta is the mean of alpha, and we know that alpha is drawn from this distribution. And so theta varies over time by this equation, and the key variable is what we call m. And m is the speed of learning at time t, and this formula here is just the optimal Bayesian learning formula that is in most statistics textbooks, except the continuous time version of it. And m is just, it turns out, again, after one does math, that m is given by, at any time t, is given by the delta t, which is so m is the ratio of delta t, which is the variance of alpha, the variance of ability, to sigma squared, which is the fundamental volatility. So in other words, what this says is that m, the speed at which the learning occurs, is given by the ratio of the uncertainty of ability to uncertainty about the firm's fundamentals. And the other thing that's true is that this learning curve is convex because delta declines, but declines at a decreasing rate because of this formula here. So basically, if you didn't quite follow the continuous time, basically what it says is that the speed of learning, m, reflects the importance of the two types of uncertainty at time t, and there's a convex learning curve, which implies faster learning in earlier periods. And then the other thing is that the learning is given by this formula here, so it's given the ratio of delta squared, so that when the uncertainty about CEO is larger, it's larger, and when the fundamental variance is larger, it's smaller, because that's in the denominator. So those are the kind of key things that come out of the model. And the other thing is that you can express the stock return volatility by this formula here, and it just says that it's approximately equal to sigma, which is the fundamental volatility. And if there's no learning, if there's no uncertainty about CEOs, then m is just the ratio of the two volatilities. So m would be 0, and this term would drop out, and it would just be volatility would be equal to the fundamental volatility. But given that m is generally not 0, then there will be this second term which would reflect how much the the learning about ability affects volatility. And so this is just M, which is the speed of learning, times this thing here, which is just basically the ratio of price to dividend. So in other words, how important the price is, how important dividends are to prices. And that's why that's M is multiplied by this thing. And I have no idea why logs are there, but that's just the way it works out. So that's, and the other thing is that, so the volatility over time will be convex because of the fact that the delta and hence M is convex over time. And so basically the learning about ability will occur most largest, in the biggest way, when at the beginning of a CEO's tenure, when the uncertainty about his ability is highest. Okay. And the other thing is that it turns out that learning affects idiosyncratic risk, not systematic risk, or the expected rate of return. So that's kind of the gist of the model. And so what we do is we use this model as kind of a framework for our empirical work. And so what we do is we focus around turnovers. So we think about the CEO turnover as a laboratory, and the learning will be highest when the uncertainty about ability is the largest when the CEO takes office. And it predicts that the CEO volatility will decline over tenure and will have a faster decline in earlier periods than in later periods. And so because of that, we focus on the first 3 years of his tenure using high-frequency monthly data. So we use monthly data to look at the decline in volatility over time. And we assume that fundamental uncertainty is constant, what we assume in the model, and unrelated to management changes. However, you're probably thinking that in the data, it's probably not constant, and there's reasons why fundamental volatility would vary with CEO turnover. One could be that if CEOs are fired at times of high turnover, for that we consider exogenously determined turnovers. Another thing is there could be real effects, real things that happen systematically after a CEO turnover. In fact, in the second paper, we will tell you about some of those real effects. But what we try to do is we try and control for them econometrically in this paper here. And the other thing is that there's cross-sectional implications that complement these time series implications in the data. Are there any questions? Sorry, I'm used to giving seminars. I give them all the time, but I'm not used to giving lectures where everyone just sits there and smiles. So, yes.
If they have no dividend, many firms do not pay dividend.
Yeah, we're thinking about the dividend as kind of a metaphor for just kind of the profits of the firm. We could have done the same thing with cash flows or something. Maybe we should have, but yes, question?
Professor, is your CEO tenure CEO specific or CEO firm specific or CEO industry specific? I mean, if a CEO has experience in another firm, or is a CEO has experience in another firm in the same industry, do you think that should be a new CEO?
Well, I think what you're saying is that there's going to be variation in terms of the uncertainty about ability, right? And so what we try to do is later we try to exploit that kind of variation in our empirical work, which we thought exactly the same. So in other words, what we think is that a younger CEO would have more uncertainty than an older CEO. And a CEO from the same firm would have more uncertainty than an outsider CEO. And a CEO from the same industry would have more uncertainty, CEO from the same firm would have less uncertainty than an outsider CEO. A CEO from the same industry would have less uncertainty than a CEO from outside the industry, which I think is what you're saying, right? And what we try and do in the empirical work, kind of the end of the paper, is to kind of exploit this variation. Okay. All right. Okay. So the sample, it's a pretty standard sample. We use ExecuComp. We go from 92 to 2006. We have all CEOs with at least 36 months in office. We include we have short-term CEOs in and out. It doesn't meaning the ones that just stay for a year or two, and those will we've done it with and without them. We consider a bunch of different turnover types. We have some that are exogenous, although actually in the slides we've gone through, since we made up the slide, we've gone through and made much more detailed types of exogenous turnovers. We have forced turnovers using the methodology created by Mr. Perino, who's standing in the back row, and we have in between turnovers. We call in between are the ones that we couldn't classify. But what we've actually done is we've actually gone through, and I'll show you some finer classifications of the exogenous turnovers right there. So there's month 0 is the month when the CEO takes office. We use 3 measures of volatility. the option implied volatility from option metrics, which is only available after 96. We have realized return volatility, which is from CRISP. And we have idiosyncratic volatility, which is just the residual of the Fama-French, the Nobel Prize-winning Fama-French three-factor model. And here are the pictures. So we have option implied volatility. You can see it spikes at month 0 and then declines over time. And idiosyncratic volatility spikes at month 0 and declines over time. Realized volatility spikes at month 0 and declines over time. So it's really it's an astonishingly sharp picture, I think, that, the kind of, one of the things actually I was talking to doctoral students yesterday is that if you actually don't see the results in a first pass cut of the picture, it probably isn't there. But if it is in a picture like this so clearly, it's probably pretty robust. And so that's what we do. And so the empirical specification we use is something like this, where we have volatility is a function of tenure. We have we have what are called firm CEOs fixed effects. So there's a fixed effect for each firm CEO pair. So if the CEO is actually two different firms, there would be 2 of those guys. And if there's 2 or 3 CEOs in one firm, there will be multiple CEOs at the same firm. It's multiple fixed effects at the same firm. There is calendar month fixed effects, so there's time fixed effects, and we have many controls. And for this F function, the reason why we don't use a linear, we could do it with a linear function, and we've done it with linear functions, but we focus on nonlinear functions because the theory says there should be a convex relationship between volatility and tenure, so that's what we do. And so here are the basic regressions in the paper. Well, if you first look at the top panel, we do a polynomial specification where there's tenure squared, and we have sum with tenure cubed. And basically, you see a negative coefficient on tenure, which means that as tenure goes up, the volatility declines, consistent with the picture. Then you have a positive coefficient on tenure squared, which means that the decline is at a decreasing rate. Okay, and then we've done these regressions over here, and we included tenure cubed, and it turns out tenure cubed doesn't matter. And so we just included them to show you that the squared is probably sufficient to capture the variation in the data. And so that's these polynomials. But we've also done these what are called spline specifications, which are basically piecewise linear, where we have a separate coefficient for tenure in year 1, tenure in year 2, tenure in year 3. And you can see that tenure in year 1 has a negative effect with a pretty big effect. The coefficients range from minus 0.6 to minus 0.99. And then tenure in year 2, it still declines, but at a much lower rate. So the coefficient is minus 0.25, minus 0.34, minus 0.4. Notice we have 3 different measures of volatility, and they all sort of have the same basic pattern, but the regression coefficients are a little different because they're just different regressions. But basically, the fact that different measures of volatility all come out with basically the same bottom line it suggests to us that we're not measuring volatility in any strange way. It's just that it's there no matter which way you measure it. Okay. The next set of tests concerns the market reaction to news. And so the idea here is that, again, think about the example I gave in the very beginning, that there's a piece of news, and then that will have 2 effects, right? It will have the direct effect, which would cause the cash flows themselves decline. And then there's the indirect effect, which means that as you get the news about the firm, people will update their assessment of the CEO. And the model would be that by that formula I just showed you. But if you just think about intuitively that if you have a firm with a new CEO and you see that he's got one great outcome, you say, oh my God, this guy is probably fantastic, right? And if you have one bad outcome, this guy is really awful. And if you have somebody who's done it for 15 years, and you've had lots of good outcomes and bad outcomes over that time, you probably won't adjust your reaction to news as much, okay? And so the prediction of that argument is that if you take a piece of news, that the reaction should have a higher absolute value. So if there's good news, it should move up. If it's bad news, it should move down. But it should move more whichever direction it's moving. And the other thing is it shouldn't matter what kind of news to look at it. And this story should hold for any kind of news. So what we did was we looked at 4 different kinds of news. We looked at announcements of expansions or downsizings. We looked at new product announcements. We looked at dividend changes, and we looked at earnings surprises. And what we did was we took the absolute value of the stock price reaction and then regressed it on 10-year and 10-year squared, right? And what we see is that no matter which measure we use, we see a negative effect of 10-year and a positive effect of 10-year squared. And so what that says is that, there's a negative convex relationship in the way that the market reacts to news, which is, again, consistent in our minds with that there's learning about the CEO's quality, and that part of this reaction reflects that learning, but the part that reflects that learning will decline when the CEO is more well known. Okay, and that's kind of the intuition. And in some of the specifications, when we look at dividend changes and earnings surprises, we control for the magnitude of the change of the surprise, and that doesn't really affect the other coefficients. But that's what that's why we have these column 4 and column 6 in this regression. So that's kind of the market reaction to news. Now, I mean, if you're like most people, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, the story is kind of interesting, but I can think of alternative explanations for why these empirical relations would hold from the data. And so what we've tried to do is we've tried to look at them and evaluate what we think are the we can't think of any other, but what we think are the most plausible ones. And the first one that everyone thinks of is that turnovers occur at non-random times, right? So that it might be the case that CEOs get fired when there's terrible times about the firm and there's some new lawsuit, or and so that there's high volatility that happens to occur when this turnover occurs, but not because of the uncertainty about the new CEO, just because that's when the CEO turnovers happen to occur. So we tried to find exogenous turnovers that are in a cleaner setting, in death, health, and retirement, and we look at a few other cases as well. The other thing is there could be real changes in the firm. So it might be that when a new CEO comes in and takes over the firm, he changes stuff about the firm. And so there could be a couple of different effects here. One is there could be he could change the assets of the firm, which would have a direct effect on the assets, so it'll change what the volatility of the assets is. We wouldn't know which way they would change, but they would probably change. The other thing, there would be indirect effects in that that when you change the CEO and he does stuff, then whatever he does will provide signals to the market about his ability, and that would, because of the model, again, lead to a decline in volatility. And what we do is we control for other factors. We control for downsizings, expansions, and new products. So other kinds of announcements that are made at the time of the CEO turnover. Okay? And the other thing is, some people suggested that there could be information revelation stories. So in other words, the new CEO could try and release information to make the previous management look bad, or something like that. And so we control for other kinds of announcements of write-offs, earnings restatements, and fraud investigations. So the first thing we do is we have and if you actually seen the paper, this is not in the version of the paper that's up on the web, but we've been working hard in the last week or so to get this. What these are what we wanted to do is we wanted to look as carefully as we could at the non-performance driven turnovers. So what we tried to do is we tried to come up with subsets of our sample that would be highly unlikely to be driven by firm performance. So the first case is if there's health or death health issue of the CEO, or if he dies. Now, somebody will always make the joke that maybe that's endogenously determined by performance, but there's nothing much I can do about that. Then we look at and the problem with that, we get a negative coefficient on tenure, positive on tenure square, but there's only like 60 cases in the sample, so they're not significant. Although t is 1.6, so it's sort of marginally significant there. And we then we combine that with the case where there might be good performances at retirements, but we wanted to make sure that the retirements weren't just kind of firings and disguises. So we looked at retirements, but we only looked at the ones where the retirements occurred at firms that were performing above average. Again, you get virtually the same coefficient on tenure as it goes from 0.5 to 0.6. And it's significant now, and the coefficient of tenure squared is again positive. Another subsample we look at is when there is no management shakeup, and what we mean by that is usually when there's a firing, they fire the CEO, but they fire the whole team or a good chunk of the team. And so what we did was we looked at cases where the only management change was of the CEO. So this is likely to be a retirement where they kept the whole team in place. And again, you get a negative coefficient, a little bit smaller coefficient, but it's still significant, minus 0.4 on tenure and a positive coefficient on tenure squared. The next cases we look at are when there's no abnormal performance. Now, some of the literature that I've been involved in, and Bob Perino's been involved in, and lots of other people have been involved in, have shown that prior to turnovers, there tends to be bad performance. And I think there also tends to be bad volatility. I don't know if it's ever been formally documented, but it's true. And so what we did was we threw all the cases out where there was below average performance or above average volatility. And again, you get the same regression, same results, but almost identical coefficients, right? The coefficients hardly vary across these subsamples. They go from the lowest one is minus 0.4 and the highest one is 0.68, okay? So it's not like we take completely different subsamples of turnovers. In each subsample, it seems like the vast majority of them are likely to be non-performance related, and you get the same coefficients, you get the same pattern. Then the last thing we did was we looked at the cases which we could tell were forced turnovers, right? And those are the ones that are likely to occur at times of high volatility. And so that there is a decline in volatility with tenure, and then a convex decline. It's actually much larger. So it's the coefficient is more than twice as big in here than it is in any one of these regressions. So what this says to us is that there's certainly a decline. It's certainly true that the forced turnovers tend to occur at times of high volatility, and there's a decline for that reason. But there's also a decline because of learning about ability in all turnovers when the new CEO takes over. Okay? We also look at post-turnover changes and real changes, and again, you can stick in all this other stuff, whether there's a downsizing, whether there's expansion, interactions with time, and basically the coefficient on tenure is unaffected. So those are what we call our time series tests. We also have a whole series of cross-sectional tests in this paper where we look at, we actually estimate the learning slope for each CEO firm. And so to do so, we estimate a regression of volatility on tenure for every CEO firm, and we get the beta from that tenure. So basically the beta from this regression is the learning slope for any CEO firm. And then in the second stage, we regress the learning slope on a bunch of stuff. We actually flip the sign of it and normalize it so it's between 0 and 1. And then we regress it on a bunch of stuff. And the idea is to look at whether the learning slope is affected by there was a question by somebody I don't know who about where you said that the outsider CEOs would have more uncertainty than insider CEOs. Well, that kind of thing that we would look at here in the gamma variables is the factors about the CEO that are likely to be associated with more uncertainty. So, and the theory predicts that learning will be that learning will be faster when two things are true. When there is more uncertain priors about his ability, so when there's an outsider versus an heir apparent, when there's a younger versus older and a less experienced versus more experienced, and also when there's more information about the firm. So if there's greater analyst coverage, if there's lower forecast error for the analyst, then you'd expect to see faster learning. And so what we do in the first thing we do is we look to it by industry, and as a sort of a test of whether it all makes sense. Not surprisingly, you find learning highest in the high-tech and health industries and lowest in the non-durables and utilities industries. Again, we would like to think that there's probably higher uncertainty about the management ability in these industries than in these industries. Then we do more specific tests where we look at the learning slope and we see how it's related to a bunch of different variables. So whether it's related to the number of analysts, which is positively related. So the more analysts there are, the more information is available about the firm, and so the more faster there is about learning. The lower forecast error is negatively related to learning. So what that means is that the more accurate the analyst forecasts are, again, the better signal, and so the faster is learning. So the negative sign means when the forecast error is larger, then there's less learning. that when there's when an outsider CEO, as was suggested in the question, there's actually faster learning here. Okay? When there's an heir apparent, so in other words, when everyone knows that Yihui is going to be the next CEO of the firm, then they've already done their homework and evaluated her quality, so she's the heir apparent, so the market will attach less of the information, the learning ability to the signal, and so the effect is smaller. When the CEO is younger, the effect is, the negative sign on age means that when he's younger, there's a bigger effect of learning. And the number of previous positions, so how experienced he is also negatively related to learning. So all of these cross-sectional tests to us suggest that there's something about the learning and something about the management that's going on and affecting volatility, and it's not just kind of some time series properties of stock returns occurring for reasons that we don't quite understand. And then the final thing is we try and draw inferences about the importance of uncertainty about management quality, and to do that, you can take the equation in one of our equations and do some math, and basically it turns out that M at the time of the turnover will be equal to the ratio of the coefficient on t squared to the coefficient on t. And so what we do is we actually look at this, and we can see that and do this, and you get the ratio. The M is much higher for young CEOs than for old CEOs, and so the ratio of sigma to delta to sigma. So that's the ratio of how much volatility is from the management and how much volatility is from fundamentals is much higher when there's a young CEO to an old CEO. It's much higher when there's an outsider CEO to an insider CEO, and it's higher when there's more analyst coverage to less analyst coverage. It varies across industries, but much less. So the conclusion of this paper is that learning about CEO ability leads to a negative and convex relation, tenure volatility relation, and we do any number of time series and cross-sectional tests which are consistent with this learning model. And the question I started the talk with is, do CEOs matter? And the answer seems to be yes. Management quality matters for firm value, and uncertainty about the quality is an important determinant of stock return volatility. And so those are the conclusions of the first paper. I guess I could take a couple questions and then move on to the next paper. Are there any? Yes?
Is the learning process more smoothly when the CEO is promoted internally?
Yes. I had that. So we have outsider CEO and insider CEO. Yeah. Yes.
Just quickly curious on your previous positions, are you differentiating between what types of positions? Were they CEO of a different firm? Were they a vice president?
I don't.
Or I would imagine if they were previous CEO, that would have more predictability and power than being the vice president of
I think so. I don't
five
know.
different companies or 5 different times.
We just count. Did we look at? We didn't.
So we actually did differentiate that, but the question here is, what's learning about? Is it about general ability that's transferable across firms, or is it more about firm-specific ability? If it's the latter, then probably the prior experience exposure of the field going to count less.
Yeah. One question.
This may not be the focus of the paper, but I noticed when you have the Rajani square regression, so you have two extremes here when at the beginning of a tenure with a convex increase, and then at the end of the tenure, which probably be the end of the 3 year, when you're gonna have a steep increase in the volatility related to tenure. That probably not because of learning, but I do when I look at that extreme, like the other extreme of the learning relationship, and see how.
I'm not sure I get the question, but I think what we did, one thing we did, I think that addresses it, is we looked at this spline specification where that looks at just the first year and second year separately, and the third year separately. So that would rule out the extreme cases. And so basically it would show that the results are not generated by the extreme cases. Yes, one last question. I should probably look, yeah.
So do you think gender and also corporate governance may have an effect on the result of the paper?
Wait, say that again?
Gender and the quality of corporate governance, do you think they have effect on your
gender of whom? I have two very hardworking female co-authors, so the gender does definitely matter. But I don't know. We don't know about the gender of the CEO. I never know what people mean by quality of governance, I must admit.
The effect of corporate governance does the board closely monitors the performance of CEO or also more of the performance of the company. Then CEO will be more inclined to align with the corporate board. So maybe the results can affect right?
It could. Again, we didn't stick in the G index or anything like that. So, I mean, we certainly could look at ownership or something like that, but we haven't really done that. Let me move on to the next paper, and then if there's questions, more questions, we'll kind of look at them at the end, okay? The next paper we call CEO investment cycles, and the CEO investment cycles sort of gets at some of the same issues we raised in the first paper by looking at how investment and disinvestment vary over the CEO cycle. So we think that when we sort of showed you that volatility varies systematically over the cycle, but there's more stuff that varies over the cycle as well. And so what we do in this paper is we divide it into we call it part 1 and part 2. Maybe we should think of different names. But basically, the first half of the paper looks at just sort of it's a straight empirical exercise documenting that these things actually exist. And the second half sort of talks about why they might exist and implications of that. And so what we do here, let me just what I'll do right now is give you the stylized facts, and then I will show you some numbers. And if you actually look at the paper, there are enough numbers in there to make you blind, so that we tried to pick and choose which ones we put in the presentation. But there are many different tests we do to show you that the facts I'm going to tell you here are robust. And then we'll talk about why they might exist. So, the first fact is that disinvestment, so in other words, selling of assets that you already have, is highest in the first years of a CEO's tenure and decreases over time. And this is true for asset sales, for discontinued operations, and we looked at announcements of disinvestments and segment terminations. So what we try to do throughout this paper is to sort of use as many different sources of data as we can, so that, and I know when I'm sitting in your seats, I'm always sort of wondering, well, maybe they screwed up for this reason or for that reason, and I'm sure there's many reasons why we could have messed up. But we didn't want you to think that there was something funny about one particular data source that is leading to all our results. So that's why we use multiple data sources here. And then the next stylized fact that I'll tell you is that investment, in contrast to disinvestment, is relatively low in early years and increases over time. And for that, we look at capital expenditures, acquisitions, announcements of expansions, and segment starts. That's the data we use there. And so the net effect, which combines disinvestment and investment, so in other words, in early years, they're selling a lot of stuff and they're not buying so much stuff. And later years, they're selling less and they're buying more, is that there's a cyclical effect in the firm growth. And that's true if you look at the firm assets or in employment over the CEO cycle. And then the last bullet point is it's robust to lots of stuff. And the one thing I want to emphasize is it's a large effect. So that if you actually take the magnitude of this effect and look at it, and I'll show you some numbers in a little bit, compared to other things we know affect investment, like the business cycle, it's like the same order of magnitude as the business cycle, if you want to sort of get it in your own mind. So this is not a small, tiny little effect that we're just kind of getting a p-value, a positive, significant p-value. It's really a large, economically important effect. And so the second question is, why would such a thing occur? And what we think is true is that there's some various agency problems, and we think that as CEOs acquire control over the board, they will tend to invest, but they'll tend to overinvest. And that will lead to investment increasing over the CEO cycle. And also, we think that outgoing CEOs are reluctant to disinvest investments they made that didn't work. So in other words, when the previous CEO is making investments, some of them work, some of them don't work, but they tend to not want to announce publicly that this was a really stupid idea that I did and I'm selling it. And so therefore, they'll hold on to investments for too long, and then when the new person comes in, then the first thing he does is sort of look for all the things that should be sold that the previous person bought, and then he goes ahead and sells them. That's kind of the story that at the end of the day, after we do all our tests, this is what we kind of think is going on in the data. And the reason why is because, first of all, if you look at the increase in investment over the CEO cycle, it turns out that, first of all, it's negative related to quality, so that the quality of investments goes down over time. And the other thing is that it tends to be driven by what we call the CEO's capture of the board. And maybe that's not the best. My colleagues were yelling at me because they didn't like that term. But basically what it means is how many of the directors the CEO has actually appointed himself. And so it turns out that that actually is the most important variable, even more than tenure, in explaining how much investment increases over time. Now, in terms of decreasing disinvestment, it turns out that the only investments that are sold right after the turnover are really bad performing investments. And also, if you look again at the management's structure, that this effect is actually much smaller when the previous management has influence on the new management. So in other words, if the story is that the previous management doesn't want to sell stuff that it was involved in buying, then if the previous management stays on as chairman of the board, then empirically they do less of this selling. Okay? And then the alternative, which we consider, my co-authors are from Minnesota, so we have to look at the first best world as everything's in the first best world in Minnesota, right? So the first best world says that the increasing investment with tenure, the CEO proxy. It could be that the CEO tenure could proxy for various things: the investment opportunity or learning by doing. And you could also imagine that there would be disinvestment immediately following tenure if there's differing skills in the outgoing and incoming CEOs. And if the different skills, in other words, what happens is when there's a new CEO who comes in with a different set of skills, well, there might be a whole different set of assets that ought to be matched with those skills. And that would lead to maybe if there's an industry shock, you go and change CEOs and you change assets. We don't find any evidence consistent with these. So basically, I'll go through the results in a little bit. So in terms of the data, it's pretty much the same sample as in the other paper of CEOs. We have 5,220 CEOs from almost 3,000 firms. It starts in 1980, and the reason why it starts in 1980 is because there's some executive firms where the CEO is in existence for 15 years when they started the sample in 1992, and so that leads to older CEOs being in the sample. We've done it just starting in the mid-90s, and you have to be worried about selection bias, and the results are the same. We actually have a bunch of different definitions for forced and exogenous. For the data sources for investment and disinvestment, let me just go through them for a second. For disinvestment, we look at discontinued operations from CompuStat. We have asset sales from SDC. We look at whether there's an announcement of downsizing from Capital IQ. And again, the reason why we do all these is because we want to convince you that the results are not occurring because of something weird with the accounting in the way they calculate discontinued operations or anything like that. But these are real economic effects, and they're robust to the kinds of data sources we use. And finally, we look at segment data, and we look at whether a segment is terminated in a particular year. And then for investment, we look at CapEx, and we scale it by lag PP&E, or sometimes assets, and we look at acquisitions, also scaled by lag PP&E and assets. We look at expansion announcements, and we look at segment starts. And so these are our sources of data. And so here are the basic pictures that will summarize the stylized facts. So for disinvestment, it just means that the dummy variable, which is if there is asset sales. So not all firms have asset sales. Not all firms have discontinued operations or downsizing announcements. And so basically the probability of asset sales declines from roughly 10.5% in year 0 down to about a minimum of about 7 or 8% in year 7 or 8. So and this is all significant. The probability of discontinued operations declines from 17% in year 0 down to 12%, and the likelihood of a downsizing announcement declines from, I guess, 3.2% to about 2%. So basically, all these things go down by about a third over the life cycle of the CEO. Okay, these are disinvestment announcements. Investment announcements, they go in the opposite direction, so that the investment rate, which is just the value of CapEx plus acquisitions, goes from about 8% to 11%, and the asset growth rate goes from 5% to 10%, doubles to 10%. We also look at asset growth for CEOs who have at least 6 years of tenure. And so there's lots of robustness checks. So there's a similar pattern for CapEx and acquisitions separately. There's stronger. The acquisition is always a bigger effect. So and that makes sense because there's more discretion over an acquisition than over kind of regular CapEx that occurs in a recurring manner. And so that here are the basic regressions for disinvestment. So we see that the tenure has a negative effect on disinvestment, as the picture implies. We also, this is a linear specification. We also look at just a variable that is a dummy if it's in the first 3 years, year 0, year 1, and 2, and that has a positive effect. So what that says is that that for the full sample, it goes up, and it goes up for all these subsamples. It goes up the most for forced sample, and this exogenous includes all health, death, and retirement, and I'll break them up separately in just a few minutes. And so then for the downsizing announcements, again, you see the full sample and the exogenous subsample are both positive, and then for the segment termination, again, they're both positive effects. And what that means is that, again, the probability that in the first 2 years there's a downsizing announcement or a segment termination is positive. Okay? And so the reverse effect occurs for CEO investment. So investment actually increases over time, and the full sample, using a linear specification, it goes like this. In column 2, we restrict it to the first 5 years of the tenure. And then for these regressions, we actually look at year 0, 2. So basically, you see negative effect here, which means there's less of an impact of tenure. I'm sorry, there's less investment in the early years. Remember, there was more disinvestment in the early years. And so the net effect on asset growth and employment is that there's a positive effect with tenure, and you see that it's positive when it's entered linearly. When it's entered with a dummy variable for 0, 1, or 2, you see a negative effect, which means that assets grow less in the early years of tenure. And the employment growth works the same way. So employment growth is lower in the early years of tenure than later on. And so. So the next thing we do is similar to the other paper. We've looked at turnovers that are unlikely to be driven by performance. So we basically broke them off the same way as I described a few minutes ago. We have the health and death retirement when there's a good performance. When we have health and death when there's just the 60 cases or something, when the guy dies or he leaves because of health reasons. When there's no management shakeup in the turnover year, when there's no abnormal pre-turnover volatility, or whether the stock return and the ROA is greater than the industry average. Okay? And what we do here is we have the downsizing probability, the investment rate, asset growth rate, and employment rate. And you see these are all positive, these are all negative, these are all negative, and these are all negative. But basically, these are the coefficients of the dummy 0 to 2 indicator. So basically means that no matter which subsample you look at, okay, and all of these, I mean, if you were to go around and talk among yourselves and say which subsample is likely to be not driven by performance, you would probably come up with something like this, right? When the guy dies, or when there's no shakeup, when performance is really good, when volatility doesn't seem to be particularly high. And so if you look at any one of these subsamples, you see positive effects in the early years of downsizing and negative effects in the early years of investment and asset growth. So this is why we think the effect is fairly robust and is not due to sort of in the endogenous timing of turnovers. And again, the other thing I want to mention here is the magnitude of the effect. And so basically, the way we wanted to think about it was, how do you tell whether a number is big or large, big or small? And it's one of these sort of puzzles when you do a finance paper, an economics paper, right? Because you estimate a coefficient, and then you can say it looks big, and somebody else can say it looks small. But what we thought we'd do is to sort of compare it to other effects that people have documented in the literature that were kind of thought to be fairly big, right? So the first thing we did was we looked at whether there's a recession or a non-recession, right? Because we know from any economics class we've ever taken that macroeconomics that investment's much lower in recessions, right? So if you simply stick at our basic regressions and you stick a recession dummy in there, you get a 2.8 percentage point difference between the early years and the later years. So I think this is between the first 3 years and the later years in our sample. And if you compare this, so in other words, if you look in the first 3 years and the later years, you see a 2.3 percentage point difference in investment normalized by K, the PP&E. And if you stick in a recession dummy, you get a 2.8 percentage point difference in the magnitude. So to us, that seems like that's a way of saying that this effect is actually quite large. Okay. The other thing we tried to do is we tried to compare it to other factors that affect investment that have been documented in the literature. So Brandon, who's sitting right there, has a paper where he looks at investment in election years and non-election years. And of course, just to make life complicated, everyone who writes one of these papers normalizes by something different. So we had to do is convert our estimates to the normalization that's used in the other papers. And so he normalized by assets instead of we normalize by PP&E. There's not one right or wrong. So when you normalize our variable by assets, it turns out assets are bigger than PP&E. So you get a 1% difference between the first 3 years and later 3 years. And his coefficient is 0.4. So this is, so ours is actually, it's a bigger effect than the political cycle. And then the other thing is that if you, there's a very nice paper by Paul, Hoburg, and Maximovich, where what they do is they look at, they use a text analysis to identify the effect of firms that are financially constrained, and then run regressions of the constrained firms versus the non-constrained firms on investment on these things. And it turns out that the constrained firms invest less, not surprisingly, but the effect of a financial constraint as measured by those people is actually 0 to 0.8 percentage points. And of course, they normalize by yet something else. They normalize by sales. So when you convert ours to sales, you get a 0.4% drop. So basically, it's I guess what we conclude is that it's approximately the same effect. The CEO cycle is approximately the same effect on investment as a recession or as a financial constraint, and a slightly bigger effect than a political cycle. So it seems like it's economically important to us. Okay. So in summary, I'll just summarize. So let me move on. So the next question, and I guess I have some more time, is why did these cycles occur? And the agency-based interpretation, which is what I explained a few minutes ago, is that they're reluctant to disinvest bad investments they have because of either private benefits or career concerns. And it often takes a new CEO to enforce optimal disinvestment. And so the implication for this analysis is that the disinvested assets should be poor performing due to mismanagement in the prior CEO. In addition, they should occur they should be larger in cases when the old management has less influence on the new CEO. And so what we do here is we looked at to measure the performance of the of the divested division. We can only do that using the segment data because we have no way of measuring the performance of the using the other measures. And you can see that this coefficient here, the original CEO replaced, interacted with the underperforming segment variable, is what's driving everything. So what that says is the underperforming segments, which are the ones that are divested, and not the segments that are doing fine. The next thing we do is we look at the residual influence. And so we looked at a bunch of different variables. One is whether the CEO stays on as a chairman. One of which is whether there is old management that is still on the board. One of which is whether there's an outsider succession. Again, there was a question about that earlier. And one is whether the classified board. And the reason why we use classified board is because this is a totally exogenous variable to the new management, right? He comes in and either the classified board or there's not a classified board. And the classified board, the reason why that matters is because that affects his ability to replace directors with his own friends and then be able to increase investment. And you see that there is a negative effect of chairman, a negative effect of old management on the board, a positive effect of outsider succession. So when there's an outsider, he's more likely to divest the old management's investments, and a negative effect of a classified board. I know I'm going through a lot of numbers and tests here, but basically we're trying to do as many tests as possible sort of to distinguish between these explanations. The alternative explanation is the efficiency-based explanation. And what that says is that the management skills determine the relative productivity of different assets and thus the optimal asset structure. And there's a nice paper by Maximovitz and Phillips and a nice Delle-Kunin paper that make this argument. And the idea is that if the CEO, the new CEO and the old CEO have different skills, then the optimal set of assets for them to have should change, and that should lead to post-turnover divestitures. And this does not predict that divested segments will be poor performers or related to the influence of prior management. So it doesn't. This story does not predict the results we just found in the previous slide, but it does predict that the more the new CEO's skills complement the firm's asset structure, the less post-turnover disinvestment there will be. And so that what we do is we look at situations where we expect the skills of the new management to be similar or different to that of the old management. So we look at single segment firms versus multi-segment firms. So the idea is in a multi-segment firm, there's lots of different skills running around inside the firm, whereas in a single segment firm, they're more likely to have homogeneous skills. And we also look at when the case where single segment firms hire in firm insiders or industry insiders. In that case, there's likely to be very little difference in the skill set of the new management and the old management. And what we find is, and again, these are in the paper, but I didn't put them on the slide. The results suggest that the disinvestment rates are actually similar to the whole sample in these two cases. So notice, even when single segment firms hire industry insiders, that's when there's very unlikely to be a difference in skills, you still see the disinvestment right after turnover, which suggests to me that the differences in skills is not what the reason why there is a disinvestment just after turnover. Okay. So there's two sides of this cycle, right? There's a disinvestment right after turnover, and then there's the investment subsequently. So the investment, we kind of have lots of reason. I'm sorry, it's been a long day. For the investment, what we think is that CEOs like to grow their firms more than maybe they should, and one of the constraints on their ability to grow the firm is whether they control the board or not. And so a firm where the management doesn't control the board will constrain him from making bad investments. But if he does control the board, then he has more leeway to make bad investments. And so what we try to do is we try to look to find a variable that measures how much the CEO actually controls the board. And what we do is we look at the number of directors that he's appointed himself, as opposed to his predecessor. And that variable is going to grow over time, right? Because it's going to be highly correlated with tenure. But what we do is we put them both in the regression, and you'll see that the it turns out that the number of new CEOs is highly correlated with tenure, but if you stick them both in the regression, you see that the year 02 dummy, which has been significant for the last 12 slides, is no longer significant. It doesn't matter. But the percentage of new directors is highly related to the investment rate, the capex rate, the acquisition rate, and asset growth rate. And so basically the percentage of new directors is more important than tenure, and it suggests to me that the control of the board explains the investment. So in other words, there's an agency explanation for why the investment increases over the CEO cycle. The last test we do, I think it's the last test, is to look at the investment quality over time, and basically the result is that that in the early years, the abnormal returns to announcements of acquisitions are higher than they are in later years. So in other words, they make more bad acquisitions later in their careers, but only if they have control of the board. So we look at percentage of new directors, and that's actually related to the abnormal return. So anyway, that's it for the empirical results. Yihui, did I forget anything? Is there any? No. Okay. Sorry. Embarrassing to do. So okay. So the implications. So let's just take a step back and say, suppose you believe that these agency problems are actually important drivers of investment, right? So it seems to me that we've documented that there's a meaningful difference in investment, not just across firms, but within a firm over the CEO cycle. And this is true not just for firings, but this is true for kind of a normal functioning firm. Most CEOs are not fired. Most CEOs leave, at after their normal tenures up, 7 or 8 years or something. And then there's a normal cycle of investment and disinvestment where they sell off assets in the early years, and then they invest and maybe invest too much and then sell it, and the next guy sells them off, right? And so what it suggests to me is that the governance matters, right? I mean, the governance is important. If we want to think about what factors in the economy determine investment, well, a good fraction of investment inside firms is done is determined by simply what the management wants to do and how it fits into their own personal agenda, and not, kind of the first best world that we talk about in our microeconomics classes so often. And it leads so in other words, governance will lead to changes of similar magnitude, comparable to business cycles and financial constraints. Another implication is that investment really deviates from the first best pretty substantially. And when I'm not doing this kind of stuff, I often write papers about private equity. And one of the big puzzles in private equity is how in the world can private equity firms pay a 30% premium to buy a company, pay themselves huge management fees, and still sell those businesses at a high enough profit to make it worthwhile for the endowments of all the universities where we work to invest in them, right? I mean, that's a pretty big mystery to me. And if they're buying well-run companies at fair prices, this is not going to work, right? But the point is, they're not buying well-run companies at bad prices. If you ask a private equity general partner, why can you do this? Basically, the direct quote is, governance sucks at public companies. I mean, this was a direct quote from a GP of one of the biggest firms that you've heard of, and we think that the agency problems are an important driver of this fact. And what it says is that the agency problems. It not just says that there are agency problems, but we've identified particular agency problems: the overinvestment when the CEO has control over the board, and reluctance to admit mistakes. We've also I think this highlights the importance of regular turnover in companies as a way of controlling these agency problems. And I think it also suggests that the CEO, if you think about asset returns and asset prices, that the CEO turnover is actually an important source of risk. And certainly the previous paper suggested that, and then the next paper we're going to write is going to be sort of looking at that as well, and how the CEO and the uncertainty about management will affect asset pricing. We actually think is a promising area of research. And that is all I had planned to say.